Welcome to another edition of Against the Current. I'm Dan Proft, host of the morning show on AM 560, Chicago's Morning Answer, and we're pleased, very pleased, for this episode to have Fox News Channel national security analyst and frequent guest on Chicago's Morning Answer, our show in the mornings there, 5 to 9 on AM 560. KT McFarland. KT, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you in
person. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's
yeah.
nice to know. I know I see you on Fox, but when we talk on the radio, you don't see me, so now you know I'm not just a disembodied voice.
Although I'd recognize that voice anywhere.
Oh, well, so distinctive. Yeah, Paul Harvey, I'm not, but I appreciate that. Let's start. People hear you on our show, and we introduce you as Fox News Channel national security analyst. They see you on Fox News Channel routinely to talk about all of the geopolitical national security issues of the day. But maybe people don't have as deep an appreciation for your background, how steeped you are in foreign policy and national security issues. You're really a Cold Warrior. Nixon, Ford,
Exactly.
Reagan administrations.
Yeah.
After you won the Cold War and proved Whittaker Chambers wrong, then you just retired.
I retired. This is my second career, actually third career. No, I started working in the White House, in the West Wing of the White House, in 1970. I was a freshman at George Washington University. I needed a part-time job to pay for college. And through a whole series of coincidences, got a job working for Henry Kissinger, typing something called the President's Daily Brief. So I would ride my bike to the White House, tie it up to the West Wing gate, and then walk into the White House Situation Room and type the rough draft of the document that then President Nixon would receive the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Those were much simpler times.
Those were much simpler
riding
times.
Your bike to the West
Yeah.
Lawn, walking into the security
Yeah.
room. A part-time intern from GW
Yeah.
for Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Henry Kissinger, who
was National Security Advisor
Yeah.
to President Reagan, to
Right.
President Nixon. And it was a particularly exciting time. I mean, it's been called the golden age of American foreign policy because we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. Henry Kissinger negotiated the end of the Vietnam War. He negotiated the opening to China.
Right.
It was the arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. And then when there was a Middle East war in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger negotiated the first ever in millennia disengagement and peace agreements between the Arabs and the Israelis.
Well, so you've, really worked for and with some really seminal statesmen of
Yes.
the last half century, Henry Kissinger being one, in the Reagan White House, Cap Weinberger
Yes.
being another. So what is it you learned from those gentlemen and the others you worked for and with in those administrations that may be applicable here 40 years later?
Well, the great thing was, I think that I learned a lot of lessons and over time different lessons, but one of the things that was most impressive was Reagan. So I worked at the Pentagon. I was a speechwriter, press spokesman at the Pentagon. I had, between the Nixon-Ford administrations and the Reagan administrations, I had gone to graduate school, Oxford and MIT, where I studied nuclear weapons, so I knew my craft. But for Reagan, everyone sort of wrote him off when he became president. Well,
Amiable dunce.
he wasn't good, he's dumb, he was just a Hollywood actor, he wasn't going to know how to be president. But he did what none of the other presidents could do, which was take down the Soviet Union. And he did it without firing a shot. So what I learned was from him that there are a lot of elements of national power. It's not just the military. It's not just making some speeches at the UN, but use real economic pressure, use real diplomatic, moral pressure, use real propaganda to talk about the United States. So it was, how do you fight a war without having to fight a war? Reagan had the expression peace through strength. Now, that's an easy one, right? Who's against peace? And who wants to be weak, right? Peace
Right.
through strength doesn't mean anything, but it does mean something. And what for Reagan, what it meant was you would have the strongest, toughest military in order not to use it. You would have the strongest, toughest military, then nobody picks a fight with you. If they were dumb enough to pick a fight with you, you crush them like a bug. But you, the United States, would not use that power. And to me, the great thing that sets America apart, not only with our contemporary nations, but in the history of the world, is there's never been a nation with our economic, political, military, diplomatic power that hasn't used it for themselves. We are at our best.
Colonial power.
Yeah, or colonial power, or invading other countries, or taking their resources, or fighting their navies. We are at our best when we have all of this power and then don't use it to subjugate, but use it to do good, to lift others up. That's why we remain Even though we have bad, periods when countries in other parts of the world don't like us very much, but we remain the icon. They're the shining city on the hill, as Reagan said.
Well, speaking of Reaganism and speaking with moral clarity, how important is it to speak with moral clarity from a diplomatic perspective? So President Obama has been criticized a lot for not being willing always to call terrorists, to not affiliate them with a religion that they're often affiliated with, and the incidents that have occurred even in his last 6 years as president. The people being targeted for their religious beliefs, like Jews in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo massacre, not just a bunch of folks. They were targeted because they were Jewish, some would argue, like me. And Reagan talked about the evil empire, and we think about that now. Oh, well, he called the evil empire, big deal. Well, it was a big deal when he called it the evil empire. He was roundly criticized. It was viewed as saber-rattling. It was viewed as reckless, perhaps even precipitating nuclear war. So how important is that speaking with moral clarity as the President of the United States in terms of advancing diplomacy that leads to peace, that kind of peace through strength you were discussing?
Look, if you don't identify your enemy, how do you know he's your enemy? How do you know how to deal with it? The thing that makes me the maddest, I think, about the Obama administration and President Obama is he was handed one of the great periods of history. At the end of World War II, when Ronald Reagan, well, even go back further, when Richard Nixon took office, the United States had one major enemy. It was the Soviet bloc and communism. And that extended from Berlin, from East Germany, all the way through Russia, all the way to China. So it was Berlin to Beijing, and included a lot of the Middle East.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
There you go, you got it, okay.
Well, Churchill, yeah.
And so what happened was that Nixon was able to hive off China and was able to flip the Middle East. So we didn't have to worry about them as our adversaries. And Reagan finished the job. He, through economic pressure and a military buildup and a challenge to the Soviet Union, which they could not sustain, they collapsed. And so Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed. So that by the time Obama takes office, there were no major enemies left. America was the one sole superpower in the world. Now, we'd had a bad economy. We'd had the economic difficulties of 2008, but we were in better shape than anybody else in the world was. And we'd had the Iraq War, which we did not initially win, but we had turned it around by 2008, 2009. So the president was handed an opportunity of millennia for the United States to be without adversaries and to be in the position to shape events, not only at home but all around the world. And he threw it away. And that's what's so frustrating. We had enormous economic leverage over Iran and Russia. We didn't use it. We let Iran get nuclear weapons. We didn't keep Putin in the box that he should have been in. We had enormous psychological as well as cyber leverage over China. We didn't use any of it. We had enormous leverage in the Middle East. We didn't use any of it. The Iraq War was won. We walked away, and as President Obama walked away, ISIS was created. Obama goes into Libya and fights a disastrous war, Hillary's war. And what do we have now? Well, we have radical Islam all over North Africa. So I guess what makes me the maddest is that we were in this terrific position, and because we weren't focused on it as a nation, we threw it all away. And now there's such a big hole to crawl out of.
What's your sense of why that went down as you describe, especially from people that you know in the Foreign Service? Is it one of my kind of senses about this is President Obama said from the time that he ran for the United States Senate, Iraq was the wrong war, Afghanistan was the right war. And as we've seen over the last 6 years, he is very intent on proving himself right by any means necessary.
Including losing.
Right, and so he got in and said, I said this was wrong, so we're pulling out. I don't care what the implications are. We're going to look over here to Afghanistan. And this whole idea of American exceptionalism and projecting American strength in places that aren't welcoming America's projection, well, we're going to rescind that. We're going to walk that back in. And in his infamous formulation, we're exceptional the same way that Denmark thinks they're exceptional.
Yeah, we're not. In other words, we're not exceptional. Well, I mean, the president's whole policy has been we're going to lead from behind. Well, guess what? If you're behind, the guy's up in front. First of all, everybody's rushing to take your place up front. And after a while, they're not looking behind their shoulder for the orders. They're just moving on, and you're no longer in a position of leading anything. You've been left behind. And that's, for example, where we are in the Middle East. Look, I think that Bush made a lot of mistakes. I don't want to be Bush's cheerleader. Bush, in the end, we realize now in hindsight, Bush should not have gone into Iraq. But Obama shouldn't have gone out. So one doesn't excuse the other. And now we're left with a mess of radical Islam is now in more places and in more varieties and in greater strength with more lethal weapons than ever before.
And so thinking about President Obama, and you just mentioned Iran and the nuclear deal, essentially what you were talking about, the surrender deal on nuclear weapons. Much is made of this comparison. It took Nixon to go to China and open the door. It took Obama to go to Iran and forge a deal with the Iranians that will help to maintain some stability in that powder keg of a region, the Middle East.
Okay, well, I asked the same question of Henry Kissinger, my mentor, my former boss.
And I bet he didn't appreciate the comparison.
He said there was nothing to it, that when the United States opened the relations with China, we got a lot for it. And we had no downside risk. China was not going to attack us or anything. So what we got out of it was a lessening of tensions between us and our adversaries. We split apart the great Sino-Soviet alliance, and as a result of our going into China and having a new relationship with the Chinese, the Russians got very nervous and they wanted to have a better relationship with us. So it was a win-win-win for us all the way around. The Iran nuclear deal, by contrast, there is a huge downside risk, which is Iran cheats. There's very little punishment mechanism if Iran decides to cheat. I think they've already cheated.
I was going to say, I mean, haven't they already beat the land speed record for the, beating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of violating that almost before the ink is dry?
The ink wasn't even dry. And so one of the reasons that Secretary Kerry and President Obama sold this to the American people was, okay, it's not exactly the perfect deal we want, but it's going to usher in this new relationship, just like Nixon and China. It's going to usher in this new relationship, and we're going to together solve the problems of the Middle East. Well, guess what? Before the ink was dry, like you said, the Iranians said, no thanks, we don't want this new relationship with you, America. We like the Russians better. And so they announced, the Russians, Putin announced a sort of a new alliance with Iran. So rather than having this long and enduring happy relationship, we turned out to be Iran's one-night stand. We got nothing for it, and we gave up everything to get it.
Well, and also not to continue that metaphor, but the idea that understand in foreign policy you don't get to deal with a Mormon Tabernacle choir.
Right.
You're going to deal with some bad people, and you've got to make strategic decisions that are in your national security interest. However, it's one thing to open the door with China, as Nixon and Kissinger did. It's another thing to, on the one hand, say, yes, this is the lead state sponsor of terror in the world. On the other hand, this is our partner in peace. It's hard to reconcile those two statements side by side, isn't it?
Well, and they turned out not to be a partner in peace. I mean, just the opposite. And as a result of the Iran deal, one of the conditions of it was like a signing bonus equivalent, which was Iran had over $100 billion of frozen assets. We unfroze those. So Iran is now free to take that money and to invest it maybe in bridges, maybe in new infrastructure at home, but also to buy weapons. They've already signed deals with the Russians. Also to use some of that money to support terrorist groups like Hezbollah. They've already said they're doing that. In addition to that, Iran, because the sanctions are lifted, has the ability to sell its oil on the world market, which they didn't have before. So whatever pressure we had, which was huge, literally, we had our hands around their neck economically, and we released it so that now there's very little economic incentive for them to do what we want them to do, for us to help shape events. So they're going on their merry way. And they're now going to try to control the entire region.
You mentioned some of the mistakes that the Bush administration made, that you're not here to be a cheerleader for the Bush administration. So as we talk about the 2016 presidential campaign and look prospectively beyond the Obama presidency, is there some space for a Republican president between the Lindsey Graham neoconservatism and the Rand Paul neo-non-interventionism? Is there some sensible space that would present a new paradigm, not the Bush doctrine of preemption, not the Obama doctrine of leading from behind, but something new that comports with the realities of 2016, the 2016 global dynamic?
That's where diplomacy is conducted, between capitulation and aggression. And so there's a lot of room, and I think that's where the majority of the candidates are. Here's what's interesting about it, is that we do have those two extremes. of how do you use force abroad, when do you intervene, when do you go to war. The other conflict we've always had in the Republican Party is between guns and butter. Do we balance the budget, or even at the expense of cutting defense, or do we keep defense sacrosanct and allow defense spending, a strong military, and then risk not balancing the budget? Those are all the things we're going to be debating in the next year.
Well, and so to a quick aside, since the most recent Republican debate, you had this rather interesting exchange between Marco Rubio and Rand Paul on that very topic. And I thought, and I'm not a Rand Paul non-interventionist, but I thought Rand Paul had a point when he said, spending $1 trillion, you have to tell me with some specificity how that makes us safer, because he didn't say it this way, but the way I interpret it is, as conservatives, we don't say if you throw money at a problem, it necessarily addresses the problem or redresses a grievance. So we don't believe that in the social welfare program space, so why should we believe that in the military space?
Well said. I don't agree with Rand Paul on everything. That one, I think he's got a point. Look, I always go back to Reagan. I mean, he's my Bible, and he figured out how to do it and how to do it right and use the economic weapon. Reagan had a choice between, would you cut defense to balance the budget, or would you go with an unbalanced budget in order to keep defense? What Reagan understood was, first you fix the economy. If you don't fix the economy, everything else is collateral damage. If you don't fix the fundamentals of the American economy, you're not going to have any money left over. Not to forget social welfare, you won't have any money left for defense or intelligence collection or anything. So you have to fix the economy, and Reagan did. During the first term, that's where Reagan put his attention.
Right.
He built up the defenses, but he didn't call out and challenge the Soviet Union until he had the economy on a sure footing and had American defenses on a sure footing. And then he had all the leverage he needed to go pressure them.
That's an important point, because frankly, that's about 180 degrees from what Marco Rubio said at the debate.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's a real important substantive policy discussion for center-right folks to have and to think about as they assess who they believe should be the nominee and the next president.
And the other thing, Dan, is that none of the candidates, well, maybe with one or two exceptions, like, say, Rand Paul or Lindsey Graham, they haven't really formulated their opinions. And the two frontrunners today are Donald Trump and Dr. Carson. Neither of them have had foreign policy experience, and neither of them have really staked out where their position is in this. Now, I think they're evolving as candidates. I think they're understanding the complexity of foreign policy issues. But I don't think there is the Trump doctrine or the Carson doctrine yet.
Right.
And that's why we're going to pay attention for the next year.
Well, and the Hillary Clinton doctrine, just to get to the other side, is the esteemed Secretary of State, who has had some experience in the foreign policy arena as a U.S. Senator, and then, of course, as Secretary of State, can assess her performance in that position. But she likes to use the term smart power. She also likes to pretend this is a new term she invented, that it doesn't date back to Teddy Roosevelt. But when Hillary Clinton says smart power, that's her paradigm for making these difficult calls in the international arena. What do you hear when she uses that phrase?
Well, she's trying to let you think she's really smart, right?
Okay.
Smart power, I'm smart.
Right.
But she hasn't been too smart. Because if you look at the policies that when she was Secretary of State, there were missed opportunities throughout, and the things that she sort of stuck on were the ones that failed. I mean, the Libyan war was a complete disaster. Gaddafi was not our friend, but he wasn't necessarily doing harm to Americans. In fact, in an intelligence way, he was cooperating with us about radical Islam. But we toppled him and then walked away from it. So now what do you have in Libya, Northern Africa, is you have warring tribes, each one worse than the other. Al-Qaeda are the relatively benign radical Islamic tribes compared to what is also happening there, which is the spread of ISIS. And you had Benghazi. So I'm not so sure Miss Smart, Secretary of State, was all that smart when she did Libya.
And smart power is, the combination of hard power,
but she didn't do any
military,
of it.
and soft power, diplomacy and economic incentives and that sort of thing. I mean, have you seen any instances where this administration has struck the right balance there, employed all the tools in the toolbox, as the politicians like to say? No, categorically no.
I mean, you tell me. All right, let's just go, for example, China. China's robbing us blind, right? They're the cyber theft. They are stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of research and development, not only from our defense industries, but our civilian economies. Do you have an iPhone?
No, I'm a Droid guy.
Ah, okay. Well, anybody with an iPhone,
Old school.
The new iPhones come out, and then within a week, there's the HiPhone, which is the Chinese have stolen the technology of the iPhone, and they've introduced theirs. Or if you have an iPad, they have the HiPad. there's a stealth bomber.
It's like from
They
Coming to America. It's McDonald's
and it's whatever.
yeah. What was it? McDonald's or something, right? It was
Chicken nuggets,
the golden
Chinese
arcs, the golden arches versus the golden arcs. Yes.
Okay,
right.
but that stuff costs us a lot of money in research and development.
Yeah.
And our defense industry certainly. And the Chinese are stealing it with a click of a mouse.
Yeah, but I saw President Obama and President Xi in the Rose Garden
Lovey-dovey.
saying that they're not going to steal from each other anymore.
Well, and then they continue to
Right, of course.
Well, they don't have anything we want to steal.
Well, right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they're stealing with us. It's a one-way steal.
Except maybe all the IOUs we sent to them, we get those back.
Well, but here's what we could have done. If you wanted to be a proponent of smart power, how would you deal with the Chinese? What's the thing that the Chinese fear the most? They censor, they do not let their people have access to the World Wide Web. Yet they all have iPhones,
Right.
they all have the technology, but not the access. Why? Because the Chinese leadership is terrified that their people are going to find out about them and then have a grassroots national movement to rise up and overthrow the Communist Party leadership. So what could we do asymmetrically? Great, you guys want to steal our stuff? We're going to tear down your cyber wall. Then we're going to sit back and you deal with the rest of the population. That would be the use of smart power.
Which was part of the soft power that was used during the Cold War, during the Reagan era, right? I mean, George Will's famous intonation that the Cold War is over, the University of Chicago won. The idea that free markets and getting blue jeans to, Russian kids, that was all part of it. Club MTV exposing them to the Western world that many of the Chinese have not been exposed to.
And not been exposed to. Now, the argument of the Smith soft power was that we're going to have the soft power relationship with Iran, that one of the things that's going to happen is now the Iranians are going to have access to American goods. They're going to have the ability to meet with a lot of Americans. We're going to do business together, and they're going to slowly evolve and overthrow.
I don't think the mullahs are so interested in blue jeans and Club MTV.
Not in the least, and just the opposite. So that's not working real well.
I want to go back to Benghazi. Before I see 13 hours after the first of the year, we know that people died, and we know that Hillary lied. But what is your take on what actually went down in Benghazi and the lessons we should learn from the murder of Ambassador Stevens and his men?
I think to this day that all the various committees investigating Benghazi never asked the two critical questions. What were they doing there in the first place? An annex and a consulate is where Foreign Service officers issue visas and look for tourist lost luggage. That's not what those guys were doing there. What were they doing there? Now, Secretary Clinton addressed that in one of her many statements at the most recent Benghazi committee, and she said, well, they were there to find the weapons that had been left behind from Gaddafi's overthrow. Okay, then the second question would be, then what'd you do with them? If you were there collecting those weapons, keeping them out of the hands of bad guys, what did you do with them when you collected them? You didn't throw them away. Did you bring them back to the United States, or did you hand them on to somebody?
And what kind of correspondence is there on topic that say we found this cache of weapons and this is what, right? Where
were those emails?
Right.
I mean, what happened to those weapons? I think, and a lot of people have, in the foreign policy world, have speculated that it was a gun running operation, that they were picking those weapons up and passing them along to Syrian rebels, who then turned out to be ISIS, or to Libyan militias, who then turned out to be the same people who killed our own men in Benghazi.
And so the lessons from that, I mean, even with those questions not quite answered, although there's some, good educated guesses about what was going on, the lessons.
Well, I worked also in my long career, as you point out, I'm a very old lady. I worked with Colin Powell in the Reagan administration. I was a civilian assistant to the Secretary of Defense. He was a military assistant. And he had the pottery barn rule. You break it, you own it. Now, he made that in reference to Iraq, but that should be the reference to Afghanistan, to Libya. We go in, we topple the dictator. That's all good, but then what? If you don't stick around to help them form the new government, to help them midwife in whatever the new governance is, you have chaos. So the example that I would use is what happened after World War II. The United States helped the Marshall Plan. We helped the Europeans rebuild their democracy. What happened after the Cold War collapsed, after the Iron Curtain came down, and there were the new republics of Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary and Romania? We helped them create their new democracies. We did everything from show them how to run elections to here's double entry bookkeeping. They'd never had that before. Those are the big success stories, right? Western Europe with the Marshall Plan, Eastern Europe after the fall of the Cold War. By contrast, what happened after we toppled the Shah of Iran in 1978-79? Jimmy Carter, president, he said, well, now it's up for the Iranian people. They can determine their own destiny. We didn't stick around to offer them the tools of democracy.
Or when we helped the Mujahideen push the Soviets out, Charlie Wilson's war.
Exactly. We didn't stick around. We should have stuck around. Not that we tell them what to do, but we give them the tools they need to make their own destiny. And we did the same mistake in Libya. We toppled the dictator, and yet we didn't help them form their next step. In Iraq, we probably went too far. We toppled the dictator, but then we tried to impose our democracy on them. And Iraq was never going to be Sweden.
So we talked a little bit about the Iranian deal. You made reference to the refugee crisis and what's going on in Syria. For the next president, what do you think is the most pressing national security threat? Is it a nuclear Iran, or is it 100,000 Syrian refugees coming to this country who are not vetted or lightly vetted?
I think there are going to be three challenges. One is going to be the whole cyber world we've now entered. What are our cyber defenses? We have very little defense of the civilian infrastructure, and we are very vulnerable to an attack, not just by a major nation state, but by a small group of individuals who have the ability to take down the electric grid, to crash the American banking system. So that's one area. The other area is going to be the continuous flood of refugees and the lack of borders. The United States has a porous border, Europe has a porous border. We are now seeing not 1 million, you're going to see 10 million refugees going from places they don't like in the Levant, in North Africa, and the Middle East, and they're going to try to go to Europe. And if they get there, then they're going to try to come to the United States. Now, maybe 90% of them are good guys looking for a better way of life, but there will be within that group potential terrorists. I mean, ISIS has already said they're going to assault the refugee population with terrorists.
And one of the things, just on this, we always have to kind of concede the point. Most of them are good people; they're not terrorists. Fine, but let's also put a number to that. When you say 10% of these populations,
you're talking about a lot.
You're talking about. There's 1.5 billion people in the Muslim world, so 10% is 150 million people. 1%. Right, 1.5. That's a lot of people. That's bigger than the U.S. military enlisted.
And that's just looking at it from the potential that they're potential terrorists.
Right.
Let's look at the economic crisis that it's going to cause, or the employment crisis, and the great sort of weight that the Europeans are going to have to deal with these refugees. But the third area that I think that's the inbox of the new president is what's going to happen in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. Iran is going to get nuclear weapons. They're a threshold nuclear state. Now, that's not good. But it's not the end of the world, because I don't think the Iranians, even the crazy mullahs, are suicidal. So the next step is then the response that the other countries in the region have.
The Saudis.
They're going to get the same program. They're going to get their own nukes. Money is no object. They'll buy nukes. They won't develop them. They'll buy them. Again, that's bad. That's, in fact, worse than Iran. But it's not the end of the world. What I worry about is 2 or 3 chess moves down on the board, is when those countries get nukes and they're toppled. We've seen in the Arab Spring that entrenched dictatorships can be toppled overnight. So what happens if one of those, name your country in the Middle East, gets nuclear weapons, and then that leadership is overthrown, and who takes over? ISIS. That's my worry, is that since the dawn of the nuclear age, we have been terrified of the following scenario: nuclear weapons in the hands of people who really want to use them. I don't think the Iranians want to use them. Certainly not on themselves. I don't think the Saudis would want to use them. But who would want to use them? Islamic extremists. They are more than happy to die as long as they can take you with them.
What about the Russians? And I raise this, I wouldn't normally raise this, but Ash Carter, the defense secretary, said recently that, the Russians, with Putin, playing fast and loose with nuclear weapons in a way that essentially we're not used to, in kind of the old Cold War dynamic with mutually assured destruction. Concern about Putin with the combination of his revanchism and relationships with Iran and Syria, and projecting Russian power in the Middle East.
I think, the United States is facing sort of immediate threats, midterm threats, long-term threats. Long-term threats, China. Medium-term threat is a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The immediate threat, besides the terrorist threat, the immediate threat is the Russians. Now, 20 years from now, they're going to be a forgotten country in civilization because their economy has no way of recovering, particularly with low oil prices. But they're going to be a real problem in the immediate sense. And they're particularly a real problem as They have nothing else to show. Putin needs to stay in power. He's not giving his people the goodies. He's not giving them a good life. So he almost has to be aggressive and militant. You know, the danger that we always worried about with the collapse of the Soviet Union was not the bear, but the bear in a corner, the poked bear.
Yeah.
Does he become even more unpredictable and violent? And that's where I worry about Putin in the near term.
Well,
not 10 years.
And
but
you have a retired Army Colonel, Douglas McGregor,
yes.
who said recently that if we were to get, the U.S. were to get in a land war with the Russians in the Baltics, you know, for example, if Putin moved on from the Ukraine to the Baltic states, to Finland, that we would be annihilated. That was the word he used. So suggesting that I don't know if it was a combination of we don't have the military readiness or the will to take the Russians on Putin's terms. What was your assessment of what he said? I found that to be a bit shocking.
And I have a lot of respect for him, and I think he's probably right militarily. But here's what's even more upsetting about that is, let's say the Russians do move on the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and they are NATO members. The NATO treaty has Article 5, and it's kind of a Three Musketeers clause. It says an attack on one of us will be an attack on all of us. We will all respond. There was a poll, a very extensive poll taken about a month ago of a number of European countries, and great numbers of people were in the poll. What would you do, French, Germans, Dutch, if the Baltics were invaded by Putin? Or what would you do if it wasn't really an invasion, but it was just like what he's done in Ukraine, like what he did in Crimea, where it's not really like a Russian invasion, but it's really a Russian invasion of special forces. And the great majority of them said, not my problem.
Right, musketeers are...
No more musketeers.
Exit
It's every
stage
man
left.
for himself,
Right.
not all for one and one for all. That's what would worry me the most, is that when you have an alliance that then is shown to be a tiger, you know, a paper tiger, then what does the United States do? If they're not going to fight for themselves, we're not going to fight for them.
Well, and Putin assuredly knows this.
Sure.
And so what disincentive does he have to not move into the Baltics?
He's probably a little busy.
And expose it. Expose
yeah,
NATO.
sure. I think he's got two objectives before, especially to take advantage of Obama before Obama leaves office. And one would be reestablish Russia's position as the major outside power in the Middle East, and he's gone most of the way there. And the other would be to show NATO to be a paper tiger. I think Putin has a plan. He's a man with a plan. I went back and I read his graduate thesis. I read it in English, not in Russian. And he wrote it as the Soviet Union was collapsing, so in the late 1990s. And he said that what Russia could be great again by taking its natural resources and using those to export natural gas to Europe for political domination and export oil to get revenues. And then you build up the military, build up the social system, and then to retake and regain Great Russia. So I look at Putin as the un-Reagan. Whatever Reagan did, he wants to undo. So Reagan was able to collapse the Warsaw Pact. Putin wants to put it together and collapse NATO. Reagan was able to drive the price of oil down and to collapse the Soviet economy. Putin's goal in the Middle East is many things, one of which is to establish their relationship as the major dominant power. But I think also it's an oil play, that if there's an alliance between Russia, Iran, they've already got Venezuela, and they can start controlling the price of oil, then he really is the unreal.
And that's the price you pay being the national security analyst for Fox News. You have to read Putin. I mean, it's not exactly Solzhenitsyn. I'm sure the prose probably leaves a little bit to be desired.
But it was fascinating. He's a man, and he's been following that plan throughout his entire career. And he's not deviated. He's where he wants to be, and he's now cashing in.
And where is he with Syria? This has also been a topic of some disagreement among Republican presidential candidates. Should we have a no-fly zone over Syria? Should we not have a no-fly zone? If we have a no-fly zone, are we prepared to shoot down Russian jets? Are we not prepared to shoot down Russian jets? What's your take on Syrian policy, such as it's discernible at this point or what it should be?
But those are all tactics. I mean,
Right.
I'm looking at a bigger picture. What do we want out of the Middle East now? What are our vital national interests in the Middle East?
Well, do you watch Homeland, the show Homeland?
Yeah, sure.
So did you see the first episode of the season?
Actually, I'm going to wait and binge watch it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get this is a little bit of a
Spoiler
little bit of a
alert!
spoiler, but not too much. But you know, Quinn,
Yeah,
in
I
the
know,
homeland.
yeah.
Okay, so it opens up. Quinn has been in Syria for a couple years, and he's briefing a bunch of intelligence officers at the Pentagon, including, of course, Saul was there and F. Murray Abraham's character.
They're back. The gang's
yeah, they're
all
there.
back.
Yeah, they're back. And so, you know, he finally comes around after he gives his pro forma report to, well, what should you do? What can we do to make discernible progress? And he says, well, you have two choices. Put 200,000 U.S. troops on the ground permanently, and you know, have them go to work as U.S. forces would go to work. And one of the functionaries says, well, that's not going to happen. So the other option is to bomb, is a reset, as he said, bomb Raqqa into a parking lot. Because nothing much has changed there since the 7th century, and it ain't going to change. So you decide what kind of cost you're willing to incur. Now this is, you know, fiction, but I'm sure they have creative consultants on there. I'm sure this is, you know, it says some basis in reality. It struck me as the most honest answer I've heard on Syria from anybody who's been discussing it, and it comes from a fictional character on Showtime. But I just wonder, are we to that point where you say, look, you either have to turn some of these countries that have devolved into anarchy into parking lots, or you have to, you know, arm whichever side's losing to keep them at bay, or you have to kind of walk away and really shut down the borders.
Okay. Well, I think those are all good options. He also said, as I have heard on this Homeland series, that when people say, well, where does this all end, Quinn? And he says, this is the end times.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, for them.
For them.
That's their game.
Middle East, yeah. But in the Middle East now, and I think where we will see it, and particularly if Egypt has massive economic dislocation, which I think they will, because the tourism business is now going to die. And the Russian tourists who were keeping the Egyptian tourist business. So that starts, I think what we could see in the Middle East is a 20-year war where increasingly the guys in the middle, the moderates who want to be pro-democracy, they're snuffed. And that you could increasingly have two big blocks at each other, the Sunni radicals and the Shiite radicals. So the Shiite radicals out of Iran, Persia, and the Sunni radicals, which is ISIS on steroids. And the problem with both of those groups is that they think they have been designated and chosen to rule the world and have a caliphate. Now, we can laugh at that, and we can say, how absurd, who do they think they are? They believe it.
Yeah.
And as long as they believe it, and they think it's the end of it.
And they're acting in furtherance of it, too.
And they are doing it, and you throw nuclear weapons in the mix, you could be looking at a situation that just self-immolates. Now, when I take a step back, how do we stop that, or do we need to stop it, or should we stop it? Or can we stop it, you know, Quinn's point. I think we have to take a step back and say, what are our vital interests in the Middle East? I think there are three. One, survival of Israel. Israel doesn't ask us for weapons. It doesn't ask us for our own forces. They want to do the fighting. They just want the equipment to do it. Give Israel and our other allies in the region whatever they need to do the job. Our second vital interest is oil. We have needed their oil. Well, is there another way to get oil? Maybe we don't need their oil anymore. Accelerate American fracking.
Sure.
We don't need their oil. So that takes care of that vital interest. And then the third vital interest is terrorists. We don't want their terrorists. How do we keep their terrorists there and not here? Well, I think we take some serious looks at our own immigration policy and really ramp up our own intelligence gathering so that we can make sure that any terrorists who are now leaving the Middle East going to Europe don't come here.
Just on that first point in terms of the three strategic interests, Israel, do you believe that Israel is on the precipice of the third Intifada?
Yes. I think it's already started.
And so how does that factor into this kind of what can we do and what are we looking at in the near term in terms of imminent threats for massive destabilization?
You've asked a really good question, and I think one that will be apparent in the next 12 months. If there is a third Intifada, in other words, Israelis and the Palestinians fight, I think the normal cycle for these things is the Palestinians start a fight, Israel responds, takes out the weapons caches in the military headquarters of the Palestinians, which the Palestinians intentionally have co-located in schools and hospitals. So the Palestinians then say, genocide, Israel's disproportionate response.
They go get a UN resolution.
And they go to the UN. Now, this is the normal cycle,
Right.
right? And so far in the past, every time that's happened, the UN, the United States, has stood by Israel and either vetoed or prevented those condemnations of Israel. What happens if President Obama, who we know has testy relations with Israel, what happens if this time he says, well, it's equal violence? We're not going to veto. We're going to let Israel be condemned. We'll condemn Palestine too, but we'll condemn the Israelis. Then what that triggers is a cascading series of events where international corporations will boycott Israel, where they will...
Not just for college campuses
and
anymore.
not just for college campuses, no, but then there will be a divestment. Do not invest in Israeli companies. When the Iran deal was inked, again, before it was dry, the supreme leader of Iran, who's the only guy that counts, not the guys we're negotiating with, he's the guy that really counts, he issued a pamphlet where he said the way that they would destroy Israel was that they would make life so untenable to be in Israel that the Israelis would deport. They would self-deport, that they would leave. And so I think that fits in with a third Intifada, the United States not backing Israel, and then life being made very difficult for any Israelis remaining.
Talking about economic pressure and soft power, there was an interesting piece, this is probably 18 months ago now, by Hernando de Soto in the Wall Street Journal, not the guy who discovered the Mississippi River,
Right.
but the policy wonk from Peru, economic policy
Yeah.
wonk. And he said essentially
Chicago West.
that capitalism is the cure for terrorism. It worked for Peru in combating the Shining Path.
Yeah.
And if we go all the way back to the beginnings of the so-called Arab Spring that didn't quite get sprung, it's Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, the street merchant, self-immolating in protesting his government for not allowing him to make a living. And so if the US and the West infuse some of these countries with capital at the kind of the entrepreneurial capitalist level and incentivize the governments there to recognize the financial benefits to them of encouraging this foreign investment and allowing street merchants like Bouazizi to ply their trades, then that's the way to unwind the terrorist hold over some of the rank and file in North Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia. How do you assess that argument, and what chances, even if you thought it was a good idea, do you give for something like that to take hold in some of these countries?
It's interesting that you said it. I met with then General Sisi when he was defense minister before he became president. And I met with him again after he became president, this is of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And he made a lot of the same arguments. He said the problem we have in the Sinai, the problem we have in Egypt, is our economy is in terrible shape. We were always running this huge deficit. So it was like their economy is spiraling downwards. And as it spirals downwards, they also run into a very large youth population, a baby boom generation in Egypt, and there are no jobs for them. And he said that's where terrorism thrives. That's the fertile ground of terrorism. So Egypt's objective, his objective, was to fix the economy so that the spiral would go in the other direction, because arising economic opportunities mean that there's something going on, that there's some opportunity to do something other than be a street gang that ultimately gets co-opted into violence and Islamic extremism. The problem with that is that the economy doesn't improve unless the security situation improves. So De Soto was right that economic opportunity is the surefire cure to extremism in any form. But in order to have economic opportunity, you have to have foreign investment. To have foreign investment, you have to have a secure situation.
Yeah, and you have to have something resembling the rule of law.
Look, nobody's doing a real estate development in downtown Benghazi.
Right, yes, well said. Before we let you go, you're not such an old lady as you describe.
I started young, Dan.
I know, right? 18 years old, part-time for Kissinger. I got it. And so, with the Republican president in taking office in 2017, might there be an interest for KT McFarland to be applying her expertise in the Pentagon again in a high post as a defense secretary or a secretary of state,
one step at a time. Dan, you're getting ahead of your fences.
Or a U.S. ambassador to the UN or something like that. I mean, are you interested in?
I would love another round in government, but
Yeah.
only for the right president. And I look at 2016, and I think it's very much like 1980. You know, in 1980, the economy was in terrible shape. We're getting kicked around and pushed around by everybody in the world, including the Iranians and the Russians. And we'd lost confidence in who we were as a nation. And that's sort of where we are today. So I know who Jimmy Carter is today. It's the guy in the White House. I know Reagan. I just haven't identified who the new Reagan is.
Yeah, I don't think the one actor in the field is the 2016 version of Reagan. You know, I mean, Trump being
an
an actor
TV
of
star.
sorts, a celebrity.
We don't know. You know, we're a year away from it. That's
I don't know.
what's so great.
Was Celebrity Apprentice better or worse than the movies Reagan made with those chimps?
Bedtime for Bonzo?
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll see.
You know, The King's Row, good movie.
That was a great movie.
KT McFarland, thanks so much for
Thank you
joining
so
us
much. It's
on
a real
Against the
pleasure
Current.
and
This was
honor.
fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.